Okay, good morning. Welcome back to class. This is the beginning of the third quarter that I've been teaching this class. And I started this in July of last year, in the first quarter, and I've been kind of teaching in 3-month quarters. And where we began studying the flood of Genesis 6 through 8. And the purpose of looking at this flood in some great deal is regarding it being an actual event that actually really happened. And certainly Scripture records this as it being an actual event. And so I'm going to give you just a little bit slight review of what we've done so far and a little bit about what's going on with this theory that I'm going to be talking about. And then we're going to get into talking about something I think is pretty interesting today, something called frozen mammoths. In the Genesis text in verse 7:11 in the New King James Version, it says, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second day." Oh, I lost. What happened? Hold on. Okay. Hope that's not a bad sign. Just wave your hands if I lose it again here. Good morning. So in this passage here is Genesis 7:11. It records the beginning of the flood. And it reads, "In the 600th year of Noah's life," in other words, it tells us exactly what year, how long Noah's been alive when the flood starts. And it notes the exact day and month, that the second month of the 17th day of the month. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. And so this is recorded as if it were an actual event, right? I mean, a lot of people deny that the flood happened, but this is an actual event as recorded in Scripture. And there's lots of New Testament passages, including passages from Jesus himself, that affirm this. Passages like Matthew 24:37 and 38, and Luke 17:26 and 27, Hebrews 11:7, and Peter 3:20. 2 Peter 2:5. These all talk about the flood as if it were an actual real event. So it appears that there's no question from a straightforward reading of Scripture that this event did happen. So we spent much of the first quarter last year introducing a model that talks about the flood and the scientific evidences that a flood actually happened. And I think this model is the most scientifically accurate and most biblically accurate model of the flood that exists. It's called the Hydroplate Theory. It was developed by a man named Dr. Walt Brown. And he began in 1970 by looking into several questions he had. He'd heard surprising claims that Noah's Ark came to rest at about 1,400 feet up in Mount Ararat, which is in eastern Turkey. So he started thinking if a gigantic boat had come to rest that high up, something would have had to have lifted it up there. There would have had to have been some kind of a colossal flood in order for it to come to rest that high up on a mountain. And it was hard for him to imagine such an event. And I think that's a lot of thoughts a lot of people would have. He thought, where could so much water have come from to have covered the whole earth and lift the ark up into this mountain? And also after the flood, where did it all go? And he thought that every attempt someone had made to address where the water came from was shallow at best, and few others even attempted to address the second question regarding where did that water go? So after the flood, where did it go? So he pondered these thoughts, that if so much water had covered the earth for a year, then there would have been a vast amount of mud and sediments that would have been present in these waters. And these sediments could have also buried plants and animals and fossilized them, and can explain the fossil record. Now we'll be talking about the fossil record in detail as this class progresses. So this seemed to be a way to explain the fossil record. It also could explain the fossil findings of sea life on top of the world's highest mountains. Many of the world's highest mountains actually have sea fossils up high in the mountains. And well, how did that get there? Seemingly, evolutionary theory also cannot explain this. There's no answers to these questions. So if a global flood produced these fossils, this could explain it though. If a single event of a global flood would have produced layers that could have been laid down rapidly over time, this can also explain the Earth's vast stratolayers. So he started to begin to study these questions in more depth, and as he studied, the more surprised and amazed he became at the total lack of evidence supporting evolution and the abundant evidence supporting a global flood and literal creation as described in the scripture in the Bible. So at that point in 1972, he became a creationist. He started to learn more, and as he learned more, he was invited to speaking on the subject, and that forced him, he said, to begin to organize his thoughts, and that led him to developing and printing the first edition of a book that he wrote titled In the Beginning. So at that time, he and his wife Peggy had decided that he would retire from his successful military career in order to focus his efforts on speaking and research. And so he began to develop at that time a theory he called the Hydroplate Theory. It's based on research that explains the flood and answers many questions of a lot of the Earth's mysterious features that have been very mysterious for decades and really over the past couple centuries. And as he developed this theory based on new discoveries, new editions of the book followed over the coming years. So the Hydroplate Theory, I'm going to give you a very quick overview of it so you kind of understand the basics of it. It's based on one main starting assumption. And the way theories are usually thought of in science is that you develop an idea and then you try to look for evidences that support your idea, and all based on scientific evidence that is well-known scientific principles. And so he started with one main assumption, kind of based on Scripture, as described in Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 6 through 8. And this passage is describing the formation of the earth on day 2 and 3 of the creation week. So on day 2, Scripture states that there were waters that were separated or divided in half, roughly in half, on that day. And it describes that there was an expanse of about half of the waters that were separated above this expanse and half of the waters that were underneath this expanse, and thus would be trapped below this expanse. And Walt termed this lower expanse the subterranean chambers. And so the important Hebrew word here used frequently that is translated as expanse, and in some translations it's also translated as vault or firmament, is the word rakia. And in looking at that, it's a bit of a mysterious word if you look into etymologies of Hebrew. But it's the root word of a word called raka, which is R-A-Q-A, which is well known what that means. It means to hammer out or beat out or spread out something into thin sheets as if it were being beaten out into a plate. One example here would be the beating out of metal into thin sheets to plate something. And there are several Old Testament passages that use the word raka to describe the beating out of gold or bronze into thin sheets to be used to plate something or even woven into clothing. So by studying these root words, meanings for rakia, we can see that the original meaning would likely be describing a pressed out solid between two layers of water. A key passage, and there's a number of really interesting passages in the Old Testament that attest to this, and even in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament, I'm just going to read you one here. This one's kind of really amazing. That indicate that the earth was created with deep subterranean waters with an expanse or separation above those waters. And one's found in Psalms 136, 5 through 9. It's a song of thanks to God, and it uses the word raka, which is the root word for rakia in this passage. So the context of this passage is creation. Of course, looking at it, as we'll read it, we see this is a clear reference to the creation of the earth. And so it uses this word raka. So let's read this passage. Now, this passage also includes the phrase, his love endures forever, which is inserted between each verse. Well, I'm going to take that out to kind of make this a little clearer as to the point we're trying to make here. So if we read this passage, it says, who by his understanding made the heavens, who spread out Raka is the word there, the earth upon the waters, who made great lights to govern the day and the moon to govern the night. So in this passage, he describes three sequential events. First, the heavens are made, which is what happens on day one. God states he made the heavens. That is the physical space that would become our universe. The second is that the earth is spread out above the waters on the second day. And the sun, and third, the sun, the moon, and the stars were made on day 4. So this sequence is restating and referring to the creation event on day 1, day 2, and day 4 as described in Genesis. And this is an obvious reference back to creation. So it specifically parallels the creation days and the events of Genesis. So here it specifically says that the earth is spread out, or raka, upon the waters. And this now becomes extremely strong support for the thought that waters were a layer of water, or stretched out solid, was created to divide the liquid waters from above and liquid waters from below. And if that's the correct understanding of this passage, this is the basics of hydroplate theory. This confirms, I think, that Walt has got this correct. So a good model, as we talked about here, can generally have a single or a few starting assumptions, and that can explain a lot of different seemingly unrelated phenomena, and which the hydroplate does. And also, a good strong theory is one that can make predictions that can then later on be confirmed. And these are all aspects of hydroplate theory. Last quarter, when we talked about asteroids and the formation of comets and asteroids, and trans-Neptunian objects, we talked about predictions Walt had made about what would be found and how the composition of asteroids. He predicted that asteroids wouldn't be solid rocks; they would be rock piles made up of loose rocks and boulders that were rounded and held together by gravitational forces and water acting as a weak glue. This has been confirmed. This has been, and there are many other predictions too. But say the sign of a really good, strong theory is that many of the predictions that it makes come to pass. And here's a cutaway view of the Earth, just showing what might have looked like, as hydroplate theory proposes as its major assumptions. So on day 3 of creation, perhaps at thousands of locations around the Earth, the expanse, this thin layer on the outside that had water underneath it, starts to sag. And the bottom of that expanse then would become in contact with that inner mantle of the Earth here at many places, probably thousands of places all around the Earth. And this results now in a deformation of the crust on the outside, forming low points or depressions where the water can then drain into, causing dry land to appear on day 3. So this gives us, I think, a scientifically supported reason for how dry land would appear on day 3. And there are several scriptures in the Old Testament that describe this pillar arrangement. We went through those before, so I won't take the time to do it again. But this is well supported. Here's a closer representation of that. So these chambers below where the water is trapped, Walt has named subterranean chambers. So this close-up shows now these pillars that supported the hydroplates above the basalt mantle below. So it's important to note here that hydroplates don't float on top of water, which is a key objection that some make who oppose hydroplate theory. Rather, water is trapped in these chambers and sealed off from reaching the surface of the Earth by several factors that we'll discuss that a little later. But this water is down way deeper than surface water could ever get to. And we'll go through that at a later date. But due to gravitational forces, tremendous amounts of heat and pressure would have occurred in these chambers. The moon also would have an effect in that the moon has a gravitational influence on the Earth, which causes the tides that we see today. So this would have acted also on this crust, causing to slightly raise it and lower it twice a day. And this moving of this crust, even though slight, would have generated tremendous heat in these subterranean chambers, tremendous amounts of energy. And this water would have gotten so hot, it would have gotten to a state of water called supercritical water. It happens when water is above about 700 degrees Fahrenheit and trapped by about 3,200 pounds of pressure or more. And water enters a fourth state where it's a half liquid, half gas, and it contains a huge amount of energy. So when the crust ruptures, as recorded in Genesis 7:11 that we just read, the waters below don't just leak out. They would have erupted with almost unimaginable amounts of force as the fountains of the great deep burst forth. So water blasted up through the earth, circling with a crack now circling the earth, sending huge amounts of water, dirt, rocks, and debris, and even organic matter high up into the atmosphere, where it came down as torrential rains, such as the earth has never experienced before. So these are the rains. When we talked about rain 4 days and 40 nights, this is where that water came from. Some of this water and debris would have also been ejected with organic matter with such force it would have actually escaped Earth's atmosphere and would have gone out. And principles of physics can explain all of this. This isn't just something he's guessing at. There's mathematical principles that confirm all these things. So these rocks and material that were ejected out past Earth's atmosphere would actually, as we went into last quarter, would come together and form comets and asteroids. And surprisingly enough, what has been found recently on asteroids are organic matter. Now, this is a complete surprise to NASA. When they sent a probe up to several asteroids, they brought back samples, and they found that they contain amino acids, which are some of the basic building blocks of protein that's necessary for life, and all of the 4 nucleotides that make up DNA. So DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. It's the genetic code that makes us us, and it's in every one of your cells, and it's a tremendously complex helio structure that's twisted. It's when stretched out, it's about 3 feet long, but it's compacted into every one of our cells. It contains billions of about 3 billion base pairs, and these that are called nucleotides, and those were found on an asteroid. So this was a prediction of hydroplate theory. He predicted that they would find organic matter on asteroids. Pretty amazing stuff. So when the rupture occurs in Genesis 7:11, it sets apart, or it sets in motion, a series of events driven by well-established principle of physics. And physics, of course, is the studies of the laws of motion and forces in nature. It releases an incredible amount of water containing vast amounts of dissolved sediments from under the crust that totally covers the earth when the fountains of the great deep burst forth. And so this word burst forth in Hebrew means a violent cleavage. So Isaiah 34:15 and 59:5 used this word to describe the hatching or breaking forth from inside of an egg, breaking the thin shell of the outer crust. So that's very much like what we're talking about here. This very thin crust around the earth breaks, and the water and sediments underneath burst forth. Numbers 16:31 also uses it to describe the splitting open of the earth. So this cleaving open or bursting forth of the earth's outer crust at the beginning of the flood would have been an awe-inspiring thing to see. So if you can imagine an ocean of water being released, being just shot up, and rocks and debris, and this would have been just an incredible thing to see. So this is the basics of the hydroplate theory. Whoops, sorry about that. So the sheet that I've got here that I had handed out, if you have this goes through the timeline of the basics of the hydroplate theory, which I'm going to be covering. And I think this is all supported not only by scripture, but by science. And so we'll get into that, obviously, as we go through the class. So what I want to do now is just kind of give you a basic update on some of the exciting things that are happening in hydroplate theory. So we talked about Dr. Brown's years of study that led up to multiple editions of the book being published. And I had the 8th edition, which was printed in 2008. This now leads up to the brand new edition, which just got released It's called the 9th edition. It's finally available. It took a long time for this to come out. I've been waiting several years for this to come in print. I know I keep telling you about it, that it's coming. Well, it's finally here. So thanks for hanging in there. There have been, unfortunately, a series of delays that have been getting this to print, but the 9th edition now has new sections, and it's been greatly updated. Unfortunately, Walt didn't live to see the 9th edition printed. He passed away in September of last year. And Walt's son-in-law, Jim McDowell, has taken over in place of Walt to take over the printing of the book and the Center for Scientific Creation, which is Walt's organization. So I spoke to Peggy, who's Walt's wife, last year, in June of 2023, and she said that the new edition of the book was coming, but she said there was issues. And I talked to her again in 2025, and she said that the printing was getting close. So every time I talked to them, the printing was getting closer and closer. But through the work of Jim McDowell, the new 9th edition's finally been released. And it's available now if you want to purchase it through either Real Science Radio, or there's a website called Mission Imperative, which is a website ran by a guy named Mike Snavely, who's a big hydroplate advocate. And copies have also been sent to Amazon. They should be available there soon as well. They're not yet, but they should be. So see me in more detail if you want more details on how to get a copy of this, if you want a copy of this. But Walt was meticulous in his work, and he was a brilliant mind. And some have even termed him or called him a modern-day Isaac Newton for his revolutionary work in geology and for the hydroplate theory. And I had the privilege of talking to Walt on numerous occasions. He made an offer that if you're teaching from the book and you had questions, you could call him. So I just think that was something real special I'll always remember. The book also is available online as well, completely for free. There's a new version called the Flipbook version. And it works very much like a real book. You can easily flip from page to page or search, for keywords. It's really interesting. It's really cool. And the book's also available in a PDF format as well. And then there's now a hydroplate.org website. This contains a variety of videos and a range of topics related to hydroplate theory. And it also includes the Hydroplate Theory conference videos of the first, what was called the Week of Celebration for the Hydroplate Theory, which was in 2023. There's also being planned a new one in December, another Hydroplate Week of celebration, and I'm involved in the helping planning that as well. So. You can also sign up there for a newsletter that can be sent you by email, so you can keep informed as to the latest news, the latest things that are coming up for Hydroplate Theory. And also, there's a Facebook page, which is pretty cool. Now we have a Hydroplate Facebook page. So I encourage you to go check that out. There's a great deal of information there related to hydroplate theory and videos there as well. And here's a screenshot of the current Facebook page. So this page is going to be updated multiple times per week with all kinds of posts and announcements of events and things like that. So some entertaining memes are there too for your enjoyment and for your humor, right? Because they want to have some fun doing this too. Another exciting development is called the Hydroplate University. This is founded by a hydroplate theory advocate named Pastor Kevin Lee. Pastor Kevin Lee came to Christ in the 1970s, and he fell in love with studying the Bible. So he started a university basically for specifically teaching hydroplate theory. He was the pastor of a church he started in Port Orchard, Washington, but he's now retired from that and is doing this full time. So that's very exciting as well. He's a very technical person, has a big background in nuclear engineering, and he's taken classes on orbital physics. He was responsible for a lot of the work that was done on asteroids and comets. There's also a Global Flood Geology Summit that's being planned for September 18th and 19th of this year. It'll be live streamed on YouTube and Facebook. Talks will start on the hour and last about 40 minutes. They include evidences for a global flood, an overview of the hydroplate theory, overview of what's called catastrophic plate tectonics, which is a competing theory to hydroplate theory, which we'll talk about in this class as well, some of the problems with catastrophic plate tectonics. There'll also be a presentation of accurate predictions and biblical support for the hydroplate theory. I'm going to be presenting that myself. So that's exciting too. So we're trying to promote this. So if you have any ideas on how best to promote this, just let me know. Looking for ideas. Brian Lauer also has a YouTube page called Solidify Your Faith, which he discusses a variety of topics, including blind chance evolution versus creation. It's pretty cool. And there's a hydroplate.org YouTube channel that contains a lot of great videos. And also there's another Brian named Brian Nickel. He's another longtime hydroplate theory advocate. He's developed a number of excellent videos on YouTube as well. So I suggest you check these out. If you need links to these, let me know and I can send them to you. And then you can also view the first 2 quarters of this class on our website, our Mesa Church YouTube channel. So if you didn't have a chance to go to this class, or you just want to review them again, or maybe you want something to put you to sleep late at night, this would probably do it, right? So we're wishing to bring Walt's work into the next generation, feel that it's important for this movement to really gain momentum, to get the word out to as many people as possible. So we think this is an important study because of what Romans 1:20 says. It says, for the sense of the creation of the world is invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature having been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so they are without excuse. And this passage is telling us we can't really understand fully God's attributes and his invisible power and his divine nature without studying what he made, what he created. I think this is a very important study. This has led to a study basically called creation science. And it's interesting to note too that this was written by Paul back at around 57 AD. And even back then, well before the scientific discoveries that we've made in the last even just few hundred years, it should be so obvious that there's a hand of some creator in the universe. It should be obvious. This was before the microscope. This was before the telescope. This was before we discovered DNA. This was discovered before we discovered a lot of scientific things now that just make this all the more obvious. So this is the reasons why we want to cover these in a class. So the next section of the class, we want to start looking at another of the phenomena. And we previously looked at asteroids and comets. The mystery of frozen mammoths is the next thing we want to look into. It's a mysterious feature that requires an explanation, and it's the mystery of frozen mammoths and other animals that have been found frozen and buried in Siberia, Alaska, and parts of Canada. And for centuries, stories have been told about frozen carcasses of huge elephant-like animals called mammoths. And these remains are unfossilized. They're frozen. They're not fossilized. In addition to mammoths, rhinoceros have also been found in these locations, along with other animals. So one key issue in this is the area of where these animals live. These animals, like elephants or rhinoceros, don't live in very cold temperatures. So what we'll see here is that they ended up in an area of the world that they're not suited to live in. So they're not suited for the climate of these areas. So these mammoths have curved tusks, sometimes more than 13 feet long, and they were discovered frozen, so fresh looking that some believe that they were simply large moles living underground. With all the observations and data that have been collected here, freezing these seems inexplicable. If it's some of the things we'll talk about in just a minute, it becomes even more of a mystery to explain this. So as people learn more about some of these strange details, there were more and more theories developed about how these animals could become frozen. And a lot of them seem ridiculous today, actually. And in the book, Dr. Brown lists 10 of these proposed theories and aspects of them, and that all 10 of them have very serious scientific problems. But we'll see that hydroplate theory explains these aspects, these strange details of this phenomena almost perfectly, and links evidences of this, again, back to being a direct result of the Genesis record of the flood. So in a very quick summary of what explains this as a result of the flood, I'm just going to give you the real quick version of this, and I'm going to explain it deeper. Is that when the flood began, there was muddy water mixed with dirt and rocks, that jetted up out of the fountains in the Great Deep. And it was jetted up high up into the atmosphere where the temperatures are much, much colder. And it froze at very, very low temperatures and fell back to Earth as extremely cold hail. And within hours, these mammoths, which could not have lived in the Arctic climates that they were found in, or rhinoceroses and other animals, we'll talk about that too, these were all rapidly buried alive and flash frozen virtually immediately as this muddy hail fell back to Earth in this giant hailstorm. So we're also going to see evidences of a great Earth roll. The Earth actually rolled that changed the Earth's latitudes soon after the flood, explaining why so many of these remains now fall within what's called the Arctic Circle. It's everything all works together here, and past attempts to explain these mammoths have ignored many established facts. So what is a mammoth? Let's just take a look at that briefly. It's a member of an extinct elephantid genus, and a genus basically is a rank of biological classification that's just above the species level. But they're very similar to elephants, but are distinguished by their typically long, spiral twisted tusks. And some species of mammoths also had outer layers of long hair and shorter undercoats, and were known as woolly mammoths. And this has led many to believe that the animal was adapted to live in cold environments. However, there's a number of problems with this, as we'll soon discuss. Also, evolutionary theory claims, if you look this animal up on Wikipedia, for example, it claims that this animal lived from around 6 million years ago up until around 4,000 years ago when they went extinct. And from previous classes, we know from many scientific evidences and from the Bible itself that the universe and Earth can't be anywhere near that kind of age. It could be thousands of years old or younger. We looked at some amazing evidences on the previous class about comets that can actually date the date of creation at around 7,500 years ago. Some very strong evidences. So again, you'll see these numbers thrown out. Such and such dinosaurs lived 225 million years ago. There's no evidence of that, actually, when you get right down to it. So these animals actually would have been created during day 6 of creation week at the same time all the other land animals were created along with us as human beings. This was an early explanation of frozen mammoths here. So again, this mystery here is just hard to explain. So there were numerous people who tried to explain it, and this was from Dr. Leopold von Schrenck, who was the chief of Imperial Academy of Sciences in Petrograd, which is today St. Petersburg, Russia. Published the following account in 1869. It says, the mammoth is a gigantic beast which lives in the depths of the earth, where it digs itself dark pathways and feeds on the earth. The account for this corpse being found so fresh and well preserved on the ground that the animal was still a living one. So some even thought that the rapid tumbling by many mammoths produced earthquakes. So as people heard other strange details, these theories kind of multiplied. And unfortunately, theories explain some details, wouldn't explain others. And some explanations like this just seem ludicrous today. Just seem very bizarre. So let's learn more about the frozen mammoths. In order to do that, we must understand much about what is known about them. So let's look into some key details that require an explanation. Regarding the frozen mammoth remains, let's look at where they've been found. So here's a map of northern Siberia and Alaska. So Siberia here, this section, of course, Alaska up here, and Canada. In the book, Dr. Brown lists 58 separate sites where the remains of either mammoths or rhinoceros have been found, and they're indicated by the dots on this. The red dots indicate mammoth finds, and the yellow dots are where rhinoceros have been found. As you'll see here, the majority of these finds are above what's called the Arctic Circle. And the Arctic Circle is an imaginary line horizontally at about 66 degrees and 33 minutes north of the equator. So you see that on the red arrow on the map there where the Arctic Circle is here. So most of the finds are above that. The Arctic Circle marks the southern boundary of what's called the polar zone. And these are regions that experience at least one full day of continuous sunlight during the summer and one full day of continuous darkness during the winter. So the region within this Arctic Circle represents about 4% of the Earth's surface and is largely composed of the Arctic Ocean, and this is where the North Pole is located. You see the North Pole up in the very center there at the top. And these land areas now are primarily known to be tundras, described as what are called tundras, which are vast, treeless regions where frigid temperatures and short growing seasons prevent the growth of trees. These stark landscapes are also defined as what's called permafrost areas, which basically means the layers of soil below the surface have been permanently frozen. And so they don't support much in the way of vegetation. They have a little bit of moss, lichens, and maybe small shrubs, but not much else. There's no trees there. If you see pictures, it's just barren. And this is a kind of an important thing to remember, so keep that in your mind as we go through this. So this permafrost can range from a few feet thick to over a mile thick. It's a very harsh, exceptionally harsh climate. And so again, remember these because these become important clues in trying to discover this mystery, answers to this mystery. This region is also known for its unique wildlife. It does have wildlife that does live there, but this wildlife is suited to live there, okay? You have wildlife like polar bears, and Arctic foxes, and caribou, and then some whales and what are called narwhals, which are whales that have the long spiral tusks coming out of the front of their heads, are native to the Arctic. So since the year 1800, at least 11 different scientific expeditions have excavated fleshy, and important to note, this is not fossilized, these are fleshy remains of these mammoths and rhinoceroses, indicated again by the dots on the map. The remains of 6 mammoths have also been found in Alaska. Most of them found in Siberia, just some over here in Alaska as well. This brings up the first major question. How could such a large animal become buried in permafrost that's permanently frozen? Some of these animals are buried tens, if not hundreds of feet below the surface. Very strange, and something that's permanently frozen. So think about that for a second. The permafrost is made up of what's called muck. Now, muck is a dark soil that contains decomposed animal and vegetable matter. And muck is also a major geological mystery. It covers about 14% of the Earth's land surface, all of it surrounding the Arctic Ocean. And pretty unusual. This is a treeless, desolate area. So the major question is here, where did so much eroded material come from that composes much of this muck? It's made up again of decaying plant material. Where did whatever makes that muck come from? Right? It just kind of doesn't make sense. There doesn't seem to be any kind of nearby source which has a large amount of this material. And geologists have drilled down through around 4,000 feet of it without hitting solid rock. And again, how could they be buried so deep in this muck? And so we'll see, only a few complete carcasses have been found. Usually when they're exposed, wild animals have eaten the exposed parts. And if we look in the same region for other frozen soft tissue remains, we see other animals too, like the rhinoceros. They're remarkably well preserved. But we also see other fleshy remains that have also been found that come from horses, oxen, wolverines, voles, which are small little animals, squirrels, bisons, a rabbit, and a lynx. These are all animals that are not native to these cold temperatures. So, but remains of them were found in the same area. This is starting to become quite a mystery here. How did they all get there? Now, if we look also for the bones and ivory of mammoths, not just to preserve flesh, the number of discoveries becomes enormous, especially in Siberia and Alaska. There were huge amounts of these animals that once were in this area. A man named Nikolai Vershegnin, I'm going to mispronounce that one. He was the chairman of Russia's Academy of Sciences Committee for the Study of Mammoths, and he estimated that there were over 500,000 tons of mammoth tusks that were buried along a 600-mile stretch of the Arctic coast. And because a typical tusk weighs about 100 pounds, this implies that there was at least 5 million mammoths that must have lived in this relatively small region. And even if this estimate's high, it represents thousands of years of accumulation. So we can see that large herds of mammoth must have thrived along what is now the Arctic coast in enormous numbers. I mean, there was a tremendous number. So one was found here, where this arrow is indicating here, which we'll talk about in a second. But I want to look at a couple specific ones that were found of these frozen mammoths. So here in this picture you see a depiction of the recovery that has been called the Benkendorf mammoth. And this was discovered in May of 1846 when a surveyor named Benkendorf and his party camped along Siberia's Indigirka River. And the spring thaw and unusually heavy rains caused the swollen river to erode a new channel. And at that, Benkendorf noticed a large object bobbing slowly in the water. As this black, horrible, giant-like mass thrust out of the water, they beheld a colossal elephant's head with mighty tusks on it, moving in an unearthly manner, as though seeking something lost. This is how he described this. They tried to pull the mammoth to shore with ropes. Of course, it was dead, but it appeared to be moving because it was bobbing around in the water. They tried to pull the mammoth to shore with ropes and chains, but soon realized that its hind legs were frozen in the river bottom in a standing position. Now, freezing river bottoms is another strange mystery, too, that we'll talk about as well. 24 hours later, the river bottom thawed and eroded, freeing the mammoth. So then a team of 50 men and their horses pulled the mammoth onto dry land, about 12 feet from shore. The 13-foot tall, 15-foot long beast was fat and perfectly preserved. Its widely opened eyes, they described, its widely open eyes gave the animal an appearance of life, as though it might move in a moment and destroy them with a roar. So they were afraid. They looked so live that it would just be living. So they removed its tusks and opened its full stomach, and it contained young shoots of the fir and pine. So fir and pine were found in its stomach, preserved in its stomach. And I can't keep in mind, this is in an area where there's no trees. Also in a chewed state. And hours later, without warning, unfortunately, the riverbank collapsed because the river had slowly undercut the bank and the mammoth was carried off into the Arctic Ocean, never to be seen again. But this is just one of a number of discoveries that have been found. I heard the bell, so I'll have to pick up with that next week. Any questions so far? All right, well, thank you very much. If anybody, again, has any interest, I've got a copy of the book here you can take a look at. To me, this is like the second most important book you've ever read. I mean, the Bible, of course, is the first, but this book is amazing. It is just absolutely incredible. Thank you again.
Thanks, Steve.
You're welcome.